Title slide, as I can see him.
Yes,
Good.
we can.
So welcome to what promises to be a very interesting evening. We've got quite a significant number of guests, non-members, visitors from the UK, Canada, Estonia, Israel, Sweden, and all across the USA. So welcome to everybody. And for those of you new to our Zoom meetings, if you could please keep your microphone muted and video off throughout the proceedings, it really helps in terms of background noise and sound quality for everybody. Please do make use of the chat to post comments. You can comment on something I've said and just say don't agree or do agree or add some comment. Please do that. And also use the Q&A facility for questions, and we'll do our best to pick those up during the discussion in the second part of the evening. Thank you very much to everyone who submitted comments or questions in advance. We've circulated those to the panelists, and again, we'll try and pick those up as time permits. And I must make it clear that all the views expressed in my presentation are mine and mine alone. They don't represent the views of the Russell Society or anybody else. And obviously views expressed by participants are theirs and theirs alone, and they also have no association with the Russell Society. The event will be recorded. We plan to make it available online as a resource for the community. So if you're uncomfortable about that for any reason, please leave now. And finally, I'd like to thank our 6 panelists. And I'm just going to flash them up on the screen now. And they are Tom Cottrell from the National Museum of Wales, Mike Howe from BGS and the Geological Curators Group, Mike Sims from the National Museums Northern Ireland, Patrick Roycroft, National Museum of Ireland, and Patrick doesn't have video on his PC, so he's joining us with sound only in the chat, Mike Rumsey from the Natural History Museum, and Rachel Walcott from National Museum Scotland. So thank you very much to all of them. Just in case things end up being a bit rushed at the end, I want to say thank you at the beginning. So the plan is I'm going to kick things off with a presentation which tries to highlight some of the key issues and to get you all thinking, and expect that to run for about 25, maybe 30 minutes. And then we'll throw things open for a discussion, questions and answers, and hopefully a really interesting interaction. This is intended very much to be a two-way process between the collector fraternity and the museum fraternity. Both groups have much to gain and to learn from each other. So without further ado, let's move on to an introduction. So the premise for this really is that today's collecting community is dominated by those of us with little hair or grey hair or maybe no hair who began collecting back in the 60s and 70s. We were on the sort of boom of evening classes, clubs springing up all over the place. And that era is now coming to its twilight years. So my feeling is that we owe it to the specimens to make sure that we do something to protect them and that they're passed on to the next generation in some suitable and satisfactory manner. And the footnote at the bottom in yellow really is a reminder to anyone that this also applies equally to fossil collections, rock collections, your thin sections, your library, microscopes, and all your other stuff. So all of this needs to be considered in the round.
Awful man.
One of the most important things is to identify things which need to be curated and preserved, that have some particular technical or scientific merit, never mind financial value. Now, in days gone by, and certainly when I were a lad, you would probably have thought the traditional answer might be to give your collection to a museum. But nowadays, that is much less likely to be the case. And there's a whole host of reasons. Some of them are lack of space or resource, possibly a lack of a suitably qualified curator, and I'll pick out the Royal Cornwall Museum as a current example and a concern, where we don't now have anyone in the building that really has any affinity or particular knowledge about mineralogy. And the other aspect, of course, is that the stuff just may not be of good enough quality or well enough documented or curated. So one of the questions to the audience is to start thinking about, what does important mean? Things that you think are important. Think about what are the values and the attributes that they possess. And I guess as a buzzword, sort of slogan, nothing to landfill would be my goal. We hear all too often that specimens have ended up taken to the tip and really rather unceremoniously disposed of. So in terms of this evening, I'm going to run through what have you actually got, get you starting to think objectively about your collection. How does it measure up, and how might you assess your curatorial readiness level? What are the options? And then we'll look at some case studies And then a quick review of the museum view, and clearly you'll be able to discuss this in depth with our panelists. And then we'll wrap up with perhaps an hour or so of panel discussion questions until everyone's had enough. And in case you're wondering how long might this go on, I think certainly not later than 10 o'clock would be a sensible finishing point. So let's have a look at what have you got. What does your collection look like? Is it stored in drawers, cabinets? Is it on display? Is it in boxes? Is it properly labelled? And is it organised in a manner that someone who didn't know anything about it, coming to it cold, might be able to understand and look at it? Are the specimens labelled? Have they got locality data, a grid reference? If there's any historical information, earlier labels, are those with the specimens? Is your label actually attached to the specimens? Is there a catalogue of the collection? And if you've got a catalogue, many people don't have catalogues. Is it paper-based or electronic? And if it's electronic, well, will it be readable in a machine in 10 or 20 years' time? And perhaps most importantly, does someone else know how to open your PC, find the password, access the database? So one suggestion that came out of an early preview of this was to put a clearly labelled USB stick in a cabinet with the collection that says catalogue, and that would at least make a start for whoever's picking up the pieces. This slide is an attempt to really get you to take a long, hard look at your collection and try and assess where you are on this scale. And this comes out of the sort of world of engineering and technical development, where people talk about technology readiness levels. Sort of broadly speaking, at the left-hand side would be a blue sky idea, and at the right-hand end would be a market-leading finished product. And I rather fear that many of us are going to be at the left-hand end, maybe 1, 2, or 3. And so now is a really good time to start thinking about climbing those stairs and moving yourself up that curatorial readiness level scale. With an ambition, I would suggest at being at 8. If you could get to 8, I think that would be a good result. And to get there, you need to have specimens with numbers affixed to them, cross-reference to the catalogue, and in my opinion, and bear in mind my personal opinion, some basic locality name and a grid reference glued to the specimen. Now, we're very fortunate in the UK that we have the national grid system, which is a bit like latitude and longitude, but specifically to the UK. And it pinpoints a spot quite precisely, 10 meters if you want to go that far. And that is the only thing that will stand the test of time. I've spent a lot of time looking at old collections in museums on various projects. And if it doesn't have the locality stuck to the rock, it's likely to get separated over time. So I think that's something that would be a really good goal for people to have. And the little number there, 1156 108 Bellsgrove Mining grid reference, is typical of one of my specimen labels. Not everything is yet at that level, but everything I've done in about the last 20 years is. So your takeaway is, if it doesn't have a proper label and a locality, it's just a rock. So do it now. So moving on to the options, I'm sort of assuming that we're ruling out giving it to your kids or grandkids or a family member, because that would just be too easy. And what happens effectively, it just moves the decision to the next step down the line. But if you're really at the point, as many of us are, where your children are not interested, there's no one in the family that's interested, then I think you need to be looking to a third-party solution. And I think it's helpful to think about the pond. And by that, I mean, what is the addressable market for minerals in the UK? And based on the Sussex show, the Oxford shows, and Bakewell, I would guess that we're talking about maybe 700 to 1,000 people. Probably maybe 10% of them might be considered as serious bidders or buyers for a collection. That doesn't mean the others wouldn't be interested in smaller numbers, but in terms of serious bigger hitters, that's probably the sort of number. So maybe 100 or a couple hundred people at most. And sadly, as we all get older, that pond is getting smaller and smaller. Some people will be concerned about the financial worth of their collection. And again, I'm sure that will be something that will come up in the discussion. And of course, this is a very variable feast. It depends very much how you look at it. You might choose to say, well, I spent £10 on it 30 years ago, therefore it must be worth more than £10 now. Well, maybe, maybe not. Or you could look at how much it cost you to go and get the thing, or you could look at what you think its possible retail sale value is now, less costs, and that's roughly where a dealer's going to be looking at. So it very much depends on how and where it's going to be sold. But the most important thing in all of this is to make a plan and start giving this some thought while you're still in a position to influence the outcome. And I would suggest that it would be a really good idea to give some thought to what you want to happen to your collection and tell some people. Write some instructions, maybe do a formal expression of wish and attach it to your will if it's that big an issue. But at the very least, make sure that your spouse, partner, family members, executors know that you want it dealt with in a particular way. And I think it would be very helpful to have some sort of buddy. So ideally someone in the mineralogical community who could act on your behalf as an advisor, because that's a bit of the jigsaw that's often missing, and it leaves relations and people who've inherited a collection somewhat at a loss as to what to do or who to speak to. So looking at the specifics of this, perhaps the most obvious thing would be to sell it directly. It's quite a lot of work to do that. It's quite difficult, but that's certainly an option. You can sell it to an intermediary or a dealer. You could possibly sell it on commission if the value is sufficient to make that worthwhile for both parties. You could send it to an auction, and that is often what happens, and I don't think that's a particularly good outcome, and I'll explain why later on. You can certainly offer it to a museum or university, but that, as we will see later on, is probably less straightforward than many of you might think. Or you can bury your head in the sand and hope the problem will go away, but then we'll be back in square one, of course. So the first point really is to make an honest assessment of the collection. What have you really got? Never mind that you like big pieces of galena or large calcite crystals. What's its real merit? What's it really worth? And to take you back into the world of industry, there's a thing called the Pareto principle, which states that 80% of the value of something comes from 20% of the inventory. And I reckon that's probably fairly true for many collections as well. So probably something like 20% of your collection accounts for 80% of its value or importance. And that would be its financial value or its scientific value. So it might make sense to get that portion of the collection sorted first. So takeaway number 2. So I've tried to put that together into a sort of graphic, and obviously the numbers here are, wet finger in the air, but with some sort of thought processes behind them. So right at the apex of the pyramid would be very high quality specimens, things that might have been figured, let's say in the UK Journal of Mines and Minerals or the Russell Society Journal, or maybe things which are just particularly good examples of what they are. And certainly those could be considered for donation to museums or similar institutions. Perhaps something that's of particular relevance to this audience this evening is well-documented locality suites and scientifically important single specimens. And so, for example, we have a group of people who've been visiting the hard rock quarries in Leicestershire for the last 50 years and probably have the best documented and best selection of material from those localities. Probably underrepresented in most museum collections. So again, a good candidate for consideration. But my guess is in most collections, and I've looked at mine as a benchmark for that, probably only 10% of the collection would qualify for those top 2 categories. You then come into the nice stuff, if you like, good quality British or overseas classics. Let's say, Cumbrian calcites, barytes from West Cumbria, nice Cornish arsenates and phosphates. The likelihood is that most museums are not going to want or need those. They already have good representation if they have good mineral collections. Therefore, direct sale, a dealer sale or an auction. And here I'm thinking to try and retain the material in the UK pool for future UK collectors, because one of the difficulties once you put the stuff out into the commercial market is it's likely to disappear overseas to Europe, the US or somewhere else. So looking to the future and trying to keep material available to the domestic collector, some sort of internal sale is possibly the preferred option. And then the bulk of the collection, I'm guessing maybe 50%, is probably general and maybe low quality specimens. And those you're probably going to be faced with giving away or some sort of low value direct sale, or maybe to schools or educational groups and so on. So there's a picture there that might be helpful when you start looking back at your cabinet or drawers. If we take direct sale as the start point, you have to invite people to come and have a look at it. You've got to prepare, you've got to have some sort of list, you've got to think about prices. So some sort of catalogue, maybe digital photos and a spreadsheet will be necessary. And this is quite a lot of work. And a recent job that I was involved in, we had about 40 people targeted, 30 of them actually purchased specimens. And from them, 7 people generated about 60% of the proceeds. So it's quite patchy, and it's very good to be mindful of that when you start thinking about the process. And obviously you end up with a tail, and you're probably going to have to discount that, but I factored that into the overall exercise. You could go online, you could create a website yourself, or you could use a platform like eBay or similar. It does require a certain amount of computer literacy, and don't underestimate the effort required to do photos, descriptions, and upload all the stuff. And then you've also got to pack things and post them. So certainly not an easy option. One of my preferred routes out is to organise an auction, and some of you will have attended several of these in the last few years, and we'll come back to that later on. But I think that's a good option for disposal of the sort of middle of the road collection into the pond in the UK. And it will be interesting to hear what people think from overseas and other markets. But again, as an example, one of the auctions I was involved with, we had 90 registered bidders. Most of them were in the room. We had some postal votes, but 50% of the proceeds came from only 9 people, so 10%. And only 5 people spent £1,000 or more, and 40 people came for a day out. So it's really important to make that assessment, because if there isn't enough money in the room, let's say you want to try and generate £20,000, if there isn't £20,000 in the room, you're not going to get to the desired result. And therefore some sort of catalogue sale may be a better option. Perhaps the most sort of obvious one that many people will sort of immediately think to is, well, sell it to someone, sell it to a dealer. So the first question is, what proportion of the collection has got any significant financial value? Because the dealer valuation will be based only on a relatively small proportion of the total collection, and it's important to be realistic about that. And indeed, it may be preferable to identify that and go for a dealer option on that part, and then do the rest of it separately. And you can expect to get perhaps, and again, this is just a number plucked out of the air, but it's in the right sort of ballpark, maybe 30% of likely sales price. So if a dealer's going to sell it for £100, you're probably going to get somewhere between 30 and 50 if you're lucky. And it will depend very much on what the item is. The lesser grade material is just going to be bulked up and will be wholesaled out at flats. Selling things on a commission basis is something that some dealers will do. Some of you will have experience of this, but really it's only applicable to the higher grade, better quality material. It may take a long time to come to fruition, and you can expect to pay somewhere maybe 20, 30%, maybe more on the eventual sale price. Sending it to an auction is another common exit strategy. There's a lot of opportunity here. There's lots of global shop windows through things like the saleroom.com and other sort of merging platforms, so that you can have alerts set up and people will know that you're selling a mineral specimen or a collection of books or whatever. Buyers at auctions generally expect keen pricing, but you might be lucky and find 2 people who are interested in the same lot. Some of you will have been at the Morris Grigg auction, which I'll mention later on, and there were 2 people after a particular lot, which went for a surprising price. But the admin costs on commercial platforms are high. The seller will typically pay about 18%, the purchaser another 25 or 26%. So in terms of the money in the room, again, thinking back to my auction example, only about half of it is going to make it through to the vendor. And you may also get charged for additional costs for photography and printed catalogues. And then the perhaps more traditional suggested route is, well, let's give it to a museum or a university or a similar body like BGS. The first thing to do would be to identify potential institutions, make contact with them, and explore whether there's any real interest. They certainly will not want everything. They will want to cherry pick. They will have particular criteria against which they will select and purchase, and they may not have any budget to purchase at all. So even if you want to give it to them, it may actually be more difficult than you imagine. So it's really important to gain an understanding of what they're going to do with it, what curatorial expertise and staff they have, what the future is going to look like, and whether the protection will be there in perpetuity. And I know you all have feelings about this. We've watched our provincial museums sort of wither, and the situation out there in the UK certainly, and I get the impression it's not a lot different elsewhere, is quite sad, really. And I'd like to just give a plug here. I know Duncan's on the call, but tell Monica I said this. I thought the Oxford University Museum of Natural History was a shining example of how to cultivate your collectors during Monica's tenure. And the museum benefited enormously from people almost queuing up to give donations from their field trips and anything they thought was of interest and value to the museum. So a great example there. The only instance I've actually found of museums actively sort of soliciting donation of materials was this one, the Seaman Mineralogical Museum over in the States. Quite interesting. You can find that on their website. The detail's not important, but just there as a thought, maybe if you actually want to acquire collections from collectors, make it obvious. So let's move on now to a few case studies, and I'm looking here at the auctions, and some of you will remember the Maurice Grigg auction down in Indian Queens in November 1996. That was a volunteer amateur effort. It went extremely well. It ran over 2 days, and I think it achieved its goal admirably. His stuff all went back into the pool to the domestic collector market. Somewhat different, the Nick Talbot auction, the family arranged for a professional auctioneer to organise the sale. Again, it was largely attended by collectors. It went on all day, a very memorable occasion, and again, I think it achieved a good result. In the Midlands, we had the John Cooper auction back in 2007. This was organised by the Central Branch of the Russell Society, and again, that went pretty well. It was the first major sort of clear-out sale of one of our Central Branch members that anyone had been involved with. And then the Bob King auction in June 2011. This was a sort of a more recently acquired collection. This is not Bob's main collection. This is basically the material he purchased when he was writing his Geology Today articles. And we hired a church hall. We ran it ourselves. John Jones was the auctioneer. I did all the admin and the preparation and the catalogue. And that again went quite well. And then perhaps a bigger exercise was Trevor Bridges auction in August 2015. We had the same basic format. We produced a digital catalogue, and we had enough people in the room to make that a success. And I'll come back to that one as a particularly good case study. And then the final one, the Ted Smithson auction at Tennants in August 2016, was quite interesting because really the auctioneers didn't make a good job of this at all. They didn't handle the specimens well. A lot of damage was incurred in the transport from Ted's home to the auction house. They really didn't understand what they'd got. The images were poor. The resolution on the website was inadequate to actually see what the specimens were. And relatively speaking, the turnout was rather poor, which was good for those of us that went, and we all had a great day. So a variety of different sort of auction scenarios. But as a complete package, I'd like to take Trevor Bridges' collection. And many of you will know Trevor. He was one of my best friends, sadly died a few years ago. And he knew that he was not well, and he was able to put his time and thought into preparing what was going to happen to his collection over a period of time. So we're talking about a collection of about 6,000 specimens, and he dispersed it in a number of different directions, as you can see on the slide. And then he asked me, would I organise an auction sale of his better, nicer, prettier things, which he'd kept until the end. And that was what we did. And I think that was a real textbook example of a good way of dispersing a collection. He decided what he thought was important, and he decided where he wanted it to go. A less satisfactory outcome is the Keith Snell collection. Again, some of you will remember Keith. He was a very organised, meticulous sort of guy. He was an engineer. And he had a very nicely curated collection. Sadly, upon his death, a house clearance company was engaged to empty the house, and they really didn't know what they were dealing with. They tipped the specimens into buckets and bins and bin bags. Much of it was damaged. There was apparently a computer catalogue, but that was lost in the muddle. And the sad thing is there were quite a number of Russell Society members within easy driving distance of Keith's home who would happily have gone and removed it and found it new homes. And perhaps a slightly brighter note is that we were able to use his Angles art collection to illustrate a journal article in the latest journal of the Russell Society. And you will find Keith Snell specimens out on the web. There's a Crystal Classics one, there's one on eRocks, Geordie Fabre has one. And I know that because he actually stuck labels on his specimens. So there we are, takeaway 4, I think that is, stick labels on your specimens. And then another one, a slightly different example. This was a lady in Cheltenham, Mary Hyde. Some of you will know Mary from the Welsh Mine Society. I was contacted by her husband to see if I could help sort out her collection. I was quite surprised at the size and the quality of it. And this happened just at the time that we were doing the Lapworth Museum redevelopment project at the University of Birmingham. And so we organised a sale. We did that with photos and a list catalogue. And I asked Roy Hyde if we could keep some of the better, larger pieces as a donation to the museum. And that's what we did. And nearly all of them made it into the final display. So that was a really nice outcome. And I know that Mary would have been absolutely thrilled to think that anything she had was good enough. So switching tack now to the museums. Is it worth a candle? Why would the museum want your collection or specimens? Are they good enough? Are they well enough provenance? Is it in good order? Does it complement what they already have? I hope that you're starting now to think perhaps this is okay. They aren't just going to want everything I've got. I need to present this in a correct manner. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about how museums view the world of collections, have a look at the Spectrum website. It's a toolkit with all sorts of self-test audits, procedures, guidelines, and so on. So it's really quite instructive to think, how might a museum view my collection? And if you look at the sorts of things that a museum is going to ask, are you sure that this is coming from someone who's reputable? Are they the actual owner? You know, did they climb over a fence and nick it? Was it collected with permission? This is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Is there any audit trail? Is it mentioned in a will? Is there any correspondence? What documentation comes with it? He's telling us it's worth £100,000. Is there a receipt that shows that? So all these sorts of things will come into the balance. And museums, or certainly serious museums, all have accession policies now, and this will tend to highlight areas of specialisation. It will decree that only material that complies with any given policy will be considered, and I cited as an example, National Museum of Wales, now generally speaking, will only take Welsh material, and they will want to know things like proof of ownership, what have we got already, any decolonisation issues, space considerations, and so on and so forth. So many different aspects before they're likely to say, well, yes, maybe we are interested. And as an example, if you have a look at the Natural History Museum website, this is the text about donations and bequests. So go and have a look at that later on. It'll just give you a bit of a sort of idea of how you might go about that. But along the way, these are the sorts of key questions they're going to ask. Can they acquire valid legal title to the items? Does it fit with our priorities? Do we have the resource to be able to manage and care for it? And that's a two-way process, because if you, the collector, are doubtful about that, you're probably not going to want to send it to that particular institution. And so all of these things are important. And also the particular one at the bottom, note that the museum does not accept gifts which include obligations to retain within the collections indefinitely. So you might think you're giving it there forever. That might not be the case. And again, you need to think that through. One of the things that may help is if it actually finishes up in a designated collection with a number on it, it may be better protected. Here's a few links. Obviously, these will be in the recording, so you don't need to worry about it now, but just some other things you might like to go and have a look at. And there are others out there, but I thought these were just useful pointers. So that's pretty much all I intended to say. I'm going to stop screen sharing in a second. So the four key things are: prepare and make a plan, be realistic in your expectations and assessment of what you've got, make that plan and tell somebody, because if no one knows that you thought it was important, it went to Birmingham University or wherever, then they're not going to be able to make the right decision. So I'm now going to swap over to general view. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Mark my video up. Okay, so I'm going to invite you. Have we got anything in the Q&A yet? I'm just looking to see. No, not yet. Okay. So shall I ask the panelists to comment first? So I can see Mike Howes there. Mike, would you like to just chip in with anything? You're muted at the moment. Yeah.
Sorry, I always have to do it once. I want to say that museums vary quite a lot, obviously, in their accessions policies. And I have done some work recently through the GCG to try and see if I could get an indication of the sort of spread, and it's actually proved rather difficult. The survey itself, I think, is quite different from many of the museums. A comment that was made to me, I think in passing, was, well, if it was, let's say, another case of sandstone from a new quarry, we wouldn't be interested. Well, actually, at BGS, as a geological survey, our job is to capture effectively the geology of the UK. So if it was from a new quarry and we had got nothing else in the neighborhood, then I think we would probably be potentially quite interested. But I have to stress, we are really, really hot on good locality information. We want grid references, and these days, with good GPSs, you can certainly get that normally to 10 meters. And we certainly want grid references and ideally a sort of estimate of the accuracy. So we're really keen to see stuff that effectively supports our understanding, improves our understanding of the knowledge of the UK. And it's better still if it's not just specimens, but if it's got associated documentation. So if you went in the field and collected it, and you've got pictures of the quarries, the localities they came from, that would certainly help. And of course, if somebody has done some analysis on it and there's, say, XRF data or XRD data, that would be particularly interesting too. But I know we're perhaps slightly different as a survey. Our priorities maybe, I think, are rather different. We're purely interested in the science. So the humanities side of it, is this a pretty specimen, to us are less important. And the other quick throwaway comment is, of course, that our main historic mineral collection that was on display in the museum you can see virtually behind me, that, of course, is now with the Natural History Museum. So we ourselves have much more limited minerals collection. We've got a small research collection that was put together, but we do not have a lot of sort of typical UK display specimens. So we might be interested. So I think that's my initial comments.
Okay, another one of the panelists? Tom? Where's Tom?
Yep, I'm here. Yeah, so from my perspective, from Amgueddfa Cymru National Museum of Wales, so obviously space is a defining factor for a lot of museums. And so museums are now thinking very, very carefully about their acquisition policy, what they can afford to take in, both in terms of storage space, but also costs associated with staff time to work on things. And Amgueddfa Cymru has taken the approach within recent years to focus very much on things relevant to Wales. So you mentioned earlier in one of your slides about our kind of current acquisition policy. It's not to say that we wouldn't accept exceptional donations of other specimens which might be able to be used for exhibitions, those sorts of reasons. But there would have to be an incredibly good case written to be able to get that through. My personal instance, so the museum has gone from the past, which was curators would recommend purchases. It would go to, say, a head of department and they would okay said purchases. It now goes to an overarching panel consisting of lots of specialists across numerous disciplines. And so it has to be a much more rigorous case for us to really get samples through that process. And it makes it very difficult when museums take that policy to go out to mineral shows and make acquisitions that way, because you cannot just go and purchase something, take it back to the museum and sign it over. You have to get the case written up and agreed before the purchase takes place. So you could end up with a potentially very embarrassing situation where, just plucking an example out of the air, going to Tucson or Munich, saying that you think the museum would like a specimen, taking it on approval, going through the necessary paperwork of suggesting that we should acquire this and agreeing the cost, only for the museum to then turn around and say it doesn't fit within our policy. And then you've got the embarrassment of having to return that sample internationally or to wherever it's come from. And some mineral dealers, some sellers might not want that situation, where they have kind of almost a long-term wait to find out whether that sample will actually be sold. And then maybe other collectors who would be more willing to pay for it instantly. And so that then puts museums kind of on the back foot almost in terms of things being offered to them. In terms of donations and acquisitions, obviously anything which is specifically relevant to Wales, so new discoveries within quarries, old material, historic material which relates to Wales is always very welcome. And there was one of the questions which was circulated to the panelists earlier, which was, if someone had collected samples from all of the quarries, disused quarries around a particular region, but they were very basic samples, so they were just representative of particular areas, would a museum want that sort of material? Our view would very much be probably not. So even if you've got calcites or quartz specimens from every quarry in Wales, if they don't have some significance or some particular relevance, the museum would very much view that as it's not worth our time. We simply wouldn't be able to dedicate the resources to curating that material and long-term storage of it. There would have to be a really good justification. So a particularly unusual crystal form, well-formed crystals, those sorts of things, but not just run-of-the-mill examples from every single quarry. We have in the past done kind of similar processes with mines, but that was very much rescue collecting. So it was a case of collecting ore minerals. So a scientific resource, much in the same way as the BGS would do in terms of the science and preserving that material. We've done that with metalliferous minerals, but we wouldn't do it with quarries for very basic sort of common minerals.
Okay. Rachel, do you want to jump in?
Hello, I'm Rachel from the National Museums of Scotland. Our policy to date has not been as draconian as Wales sounds. We do obviously have to do a purchase acquisition form, and we have to do the due diligence that is really coming and affecting all museums with proof. But we are not required to just focus on Scottish material. In fact, historically, our collection has been more than half international, so that's still interest of ours. The other thing I want to plug for our museum is that we've got space. We've got quite a lot of space, and it's beautifully ordered, as you went to my talk at Christmas time. Yeah, that said, we have the usual museum policy of, you know, why should we collect the specimen? Does it have a particular scientific need or history? Or what is the social story? What is it displayable? You know, just the usual there. Yeah. Anything else that you want me to cover?
I think it's just useful to have a general response from each of you, and then we'll take some specific questions. So, Mike, do you want to go next? Oh, that's Mike Rumsey I was thinking of. I'm looking in the middle of my screen.
Jimmy Lights. Yeah. Yeah, sure. So actually, between Tom and Rachel, you've covered a lot of the things, I guess. Naturalist Museum tends to be more international in its focus. It retains an international collection. There are sort of 5 sort of overarching principles of collections development policy across museum, and something that's added to the collection needs to show that it can do one or multiple of those things. So that's either bridging or filling a gap within a collection where there is a requirement to have an appropriate breadth of coverage or depth of coverage, scientific or scholarly importance to the discipline in question, fulfillment of a very specific research need. Now that research need might be scientific, ongoing, and of course we've got a lot of researchers who are based at museum, so kind of in many ways we're a museum with a bit of university attached, if you like, and so we have active people working on big projects all the time, and so there might be a requirement to get samples that specifically sort out or help their research. Significance to the history of the whole the discipline, and then the potential for public exhibition or education. But with that one, it's good to say that really that has to be something that's already in the planning, because you know you could display anything. So really, to fulfill that need, it sort of has to be something that okay, well, there's a gap that really needs to be filled, or there is an upcoming display on X, Y, Z.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Mike Sims.
Oh right, yeah. I'd say, sorry. Yeah, I'd say pretty similar to Rachel. You know, it's not too draconian here. I guess we tend to sort of concentrate on sort of Irish material, the whole, because I'm National Museums Northern Ireland, but we consider it's the island of Ireland, so we take stuff from anywhere. We don't really have the same. Yeah, the population of Ireland is relatively small, so there's not actually that many collectors. So, and I'm not actually aware of many of them at all. There's Harry Foy, of course, who's now gone, I think. There's my collection, which I suppose I should deal with. Anyway, yeah, so we don't have sort of perhaps the same issues as keeping an eye on sort of material that might sort of disappear in the tip or whatever. In terms of purchasing such like, I have very, very limited funds indeed. I can't usually justify buying anything for research. Everything tends to be for display. It would be because the fund is so limited, and also I'm the only geologist left. And in fact, there's only about 4 or 5 science curators full stop, and half of those are part-time. So higher up in the organization, there's virtually no scientists. They don't, unfortunately, really realize sometimes the significance of what we do. Yeah, I think that's probably about it, I would say there.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
You can all read in the chat. Patrick can't do the sound, but if you scroll into the chat, you'll see that he's written the National Museum of Ireland does follow the normal current criteria for acquisitions. Very fortunately, we are similar to Rachel. We have lots of potential space, which is wonderful. We will, of course, not take everything, but if there's an Irish interest, be it scientific or cultural, we have plans for future space to take material. So good news on that level. So thank you to all the panelists. There's one other person I'd just like to call forward. Ian Bruce, are you there? Ian, you want to unmute? Has he disappeared? Okay.
I'm
Ian,
here. Have you got me?
Oh, yeah, great. So Ian, many of you will know Ian. Ian's MD and owner of Crystal Classics, one of the largest mineral dealerships in the world. And Ian expressed an interest in joining. Obviously, he has a different dimension to this issue. And I'd like to let Ian just say a few words. Off you go, Ian.
Yeah, we all know the collecting fraternity has changed over the years. As you said at the start, Roy, we're all getting older and grayer, including myself. And I think it's a misunderstanding that there's a very strong young community out there. We just need to learn how to. We just need to access them. We're very busy with our online sales to these guys. They don't really come to shows. They're not part of the Russell Society. We get a lot of them come to visit us. We're involved in this dispersal of probably more mineral collections than just about any other dealership worldwide. We do a lot of close work with collectors. We certainly pay more than 30 cents in the dollar for collections. For good quality, we'll pay 80 cents in the dollar. It's 80 pence in the pound. It all depends on the quality of the collection. We're in a lot of people's wills worldwide to dispose of the collections when the time comes. And we all like to see things stay in the UK, and certainly for British minerals, most of them do stay in the UK. The UK collector scene is still very strong. Those of you that have been to our open days down at Crystal Classics here in East Coker, we will get a lot of people through the door over the weekend. The UK has a very strong collector scene, and we certainly do everything we can to make sure that it survives, and the right minerals are here for people to buy.
Yep. Okay, great. Thanks very much, Ian. Okay, so we've got a few questions and comments I can see in the chat. I'm just going to scroll down. So there was one specific one, which I think is a big issue for us, and that was from Chris Finch. And he was asking about the question of proving a sort of audit trail. I'd be interested to know what proof of ownership a self-collected specimen is required to have by a museum. I'm assuming, perhaps incorrectly, there would be a common standard. I think sadly not. Who would like to go first? No. Rachel?
Oh, right. Just actually gone through this yesterday. At the moment, I think we're just feeling our way in this world. And we've only recently got our proposed acquisition process put through, and we have to verbally check that the title is okay and a provenance statement we have to provide evidence. For example, we recently got a specimen and we had took a photocopy of the sales docket of that specimen and put it on. It's not an essential thing at the moment. You can do a purchase acquisition without it, but yeah, it's just, was it? Yeah, we're just feeling our way at the moment.
I mean, I think
Right, can I come in here? Michael McMullen,
Oh yeah, sure.
can you hear me right?
yes, yep.
Yeah, as regards Scotland, and I'd be interested to hear what you say, Rachel. Obviously, the majority of people on this call were collecting in the 70s and 80s, and that was before the plethora of restrictions of Nature Scotland and its four bodies, and ORC 25s when they're trying to stop you collecting in sites. All you had to do in those days was ask permission from the farmer or the landowner. So how does that square with displaying that you've got a legally possessed specimen?
How does that square with what? Sorry?
That your requirement to show that it's legally collected.
I mean, a lot of our collection will be from these places that have now got different rules. I would imagine if the rules, as long as you were legally obeying the rules at the time of collection, I'm going to guess that you might be okay. I'd have to double check that, of course. Obviously, there's issues with gold and other mines royal things that we just don't want to go down that line anymore, having had this issue with the nugget recently.
It's just that the other museums speaking there were saying they're wanting specific documentation to show ownership of proof of it's legally collected. I'd be interested to know what specifically they were requiring.
Well, I just gave you an example of a sale recently.
Well, if it's self-collected, it'd be different.
I know there's a lot that's just impractical. I can't really answer that at the moment, but I would hope that they would be pragmatic about it. I will find out. I should have asked about that beforehand, but
could I come in there, Roy?
Yes, by the way, Phil. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there is a big difference between self-collected and purchase specimens, and I would agree with the previous questioner that much of us have collected material with just verbal permissions, and we can declare that to be the case, but we can't do anything more. But I'm curious as to why the emphasis on purchase specimens is that you have a copy of the receipt for the specimen, but what do we know has happened behind the obtaining that specimen before it was sold? I mean, that could be just as problematic as some self-collected material. That seems odd to me, to almost accept that purchase material is okay, but self-collected might not be. And because my concern is that very important scientific and aesthetic looking, and I'm a fossil collector, so it's a slightly different angle, but that material could be lost to UK museums and sites. I don't understand why that should be.
Yeah, I should clarify the article that we were donated, that we wanted to see this form, was of particular historical importance, and we accepted it on the basis that we knew the provenance of that historical item. In other ones, yes, indeed, you can't go and get a copy of every purchase, for a specimen that's gone through many people's hands. I just think that's not practical. You just have to say, I think you provide a provenance statement that you bought it back in 1972, and before there was you had to worry about these things, and I think that would have to do at the moment.
Or you collected it with verbal permission from wherever. There isn't any difference there. I don't think that self-collected material should be abandoned because there isn't the same documentation of permission. Yeah,
in general, yeah. When it's historically important, maybe it's a different thing. Hey, other museums, Mike Rumsey, help me out on this one. We're just feeling our way.
Can I comment from the survey's perspective in that we require people to effectively self-certify that they have legal title to it. We normally like a date when it was collected, and if there are problems with, say, a date and it was collected on a SSSI, we would certainly need to know that it was collected either with permission or it preceded the date at which it became a SSSI. In other words, we don't interpret current legislation retrospectively, because that's normally a fundamental tenet of English law, at least. I should say too that as far as we're concerned, because we by and large don't pay for anything, a lot of what we're offered is self-collected material, and it's a real bonus. We would normally hope that comes with field notebooks, and if they've been meticulous, they may well have recorded that they met the farmer at such and such and had permission to collect from this area, or whatever it is. That's the sort of information that you would normally put down in your field notebook if you were doing an accurate, detailed job. And probably if you weren't, then your collection would probably not be of the sort that we would be that interested in acquiring anyway.
Yeah.
So
I think one of the things that came out of our pre-meeting discussion was that something that we can all do starting tomorrow is start keeping those sorts of records. So if it was collected on a Russell Society field trip, for example, or an SMLS field trip, put that in your catalogue, because that is pretty reasonable evidence that it was done properly. And it would be possible to go back into the newsletter and see that, yes, there were 20 people and one of them was Roy Starkey or Peter Briscoe, and they were on that trip. And that would strengthen your case, I think. But I do see this as a big problem for the community, because I suspect the majority of us and the majority of our collections, we cannot prove the circumstances under which the stuff was acquired. And I think that's something that I'd like to see GCG and all the curators take on board. And one of the problems is that increasingly curators are more remote from the policymakers, sadly. You know, the days of when you could go in and see the curator and he could make a decision. Increasingly, there are things called collections managers, and they're people that operate processes and procedures. And you know, please shout me down, Mike or Rachel or Mike, whoever. You know, I know this is true. It might be difficult territory, but that's a problem, and it's driven by the things that you see about, you know, repatriating skulls and artifacts and ethnographic collections that we stole from the empire. And what's really needed, in my opinion, is some pragmatism that actually says, hey guys, this is actually a rock. You know, there's quite a lot more of it out there. This is just a nice piece. The chances of anyone pursuing this is very low. And so that really somehow needs to be incorporated into the thinking. And now is a good time to start doing that.
Roy, can I butt in here?
Yep.
I've arranged a number of trips to SSSIs, and no one has ever asked me for a copy of the permission to go with their specimens. I had probably on my computer got all the records for all the SSSI trips I've arranged. Perhaps it ought to be a regular thing on our trips that we actually issue either digitally or on paper of our permission.
Yeah, that'd be a great idea.
And I mean, I like everything that's been said so far, but I know a couple of examples. I think Rupert can give a few examples of things that have gone seriously wrong in recent years. And whatever your plan is, it's got to be bomb-proof. And simply saying it's a letter with the will, that is totally irrelevant, because most of you here are married. And if you go first, there is absolutely no need for your spouse to go and get a copy of your will, because in law, because you're married, your property becomes your wife's property on your death. So why on earth would they go and look at the will at the solicitors? I do know of an example. Someone said to me some years ago, I've left a letter with my solicitor with my will. Well, sorry, but the widow's already gone and got rid of the collection. She virtually gave it away. And I'm expecting in a few years' time, a solicitor to come to me and say, I've got this letter. What does it mean? Well, it means that the widow had dementia and he got a solicitor.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that's back to the early comment about making sure you make your instructions
Yeah,
clear to
yeah. I
all
mean,
parties. You know, I mean, I would expect my spouse to do what I've asked. I don't think
yeah, but
most people would expect otherwise. You know,
what percentage of us will get dementia, and what percentage of our wives, spouses, or whatever partners will get dementia? Your plans have got to be absolutely bomb-proof. You've got to get someone younger than you, not going to lose their mind in charge.
yeah. Well, hence the buddy idea, and appoint someone in the community who is likely to outlive you. You know, 10 years is probably a safe margin. Yeah, I have a plan that, along those lines. So,
And
it's
I
a
think
good time to think about it. I hope all of you are still going to be here in 10 years' time. I would hope. But
I think,
you know, yeah, let's
Right,
make a plan.
can I just say that this problem of self-collected material, surely the curators on this panel should come up with a commonality protocol that takes care of the problem of self-collected verbal acceptance to collecting site X, because so much material was collected under that scheme, which will obviously not be applicable for the higher, more stringent criteria that museums are trying to apply. You'll be effectively long-term reducing your historical collection base by making such a high standard of acceptance criteria that so much material is going to be rejected because it's going to fall through one of the loopholes.
Yeah, I agree. I think Mike Howe's earlier thing about BGS require kind of effectively self-certification. Yeah, BGS is quite a powerful organization in this whole arena, as it were. And so if it was say, well, that's what they do, then the people that are making the policies, for instance, in our museum, which they're not admittedly very strict, you know, I bring all sorts of stuff in, nobody really quibbles. It's mostly the policies being done by people with art sort of history sort of background, and they're thinking about paintings and human skulls and ethnographic stuff. And as Roy said, you know, it's a rock, and there's lots of it out there. This is a nice one, and I think there needs to be a sort of degree of education, and they should be listening to us as geologists. Well, you know, this is the situation, and also have the self-certification. They're very risk averse as well, because they say, oh, what if somebody comes along and challenges us? And you say, well, yes, we deal with that. Nobody ever will. I don't think.
Well, that's it. I mean, statistically, it's extremely low. Yes, there may be occasional cases, but an actual, in terms of quantity, it's very, very low. And surely we should have a more flexible acquisition policy within the 4 nations to have material accepted.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like I say, I think the BGS one where people self-certify, and if somebody should then come along and challenge it and say, well, actually, no, that belongs to us, then to some extent it will go back to the sort of person, if they're still alive, saying, well, but can you prove this? And it's hardly ever likely to happen. It might be the odd gold nugget and things like that, but for the average thing.
Do you think it's being mixed up with material from abroad, where certainly on the fossil side there have been repatriation issues from the likes of Brazil and China? Museums are panicking about that, but I don't think there's the same issue with UK material.
Yeah, I think you're right, is that there is this issue. It's the same with sort of meteorites. There were certain meteorites which, you know, the shutters came down on those. So, you know.
Could I just interject there in terms of fossils? There was quite a high profile case of the material from Lesmahago being sold abroad. And I think the museum had to repatriate all the fossils back to the UK. So it's quite common in Scotland for fossils to have to be repatriated.
But that's not within Scotland, is it? That you're talking about material that's gone from Scotland to abroad.
Illegally collected, yes. It was challenged by Nature Scotland.
And we're also talking about material in museums that gets there from the likes of China and Brazil. What we shouldn't be talking about is material collected in the UK that stays in the UK. There is very little risk to any of that at all.
Yeah. Okay.
Depends if it was legally collected.
Roy, can I just make a few points? Sorry.
Yes, Tom.
Nobody spotted I had the hand up.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so going back, so I've just written down when Rachel was talking earlier, I'd written down minefield and grey area. So it is an absolute, really difficult situation to try and interpret all of this. And I think a couple of people, Roy, yourself, and Mike Sims, raised relevant points, which is the overlap with institutions where you have multiple disciplines. People treat geology the same as archaeology. And so within archaeology, you have to get written consent of a landowner before you can go metal detectoring. And they're using that assumption that to go and collect geological samples, that we would all go and write beforehand to a landowner to get permission before you go and do anything, which isn't always the case. So you've got obviously different types of permissions. You could have a verbal permission of the farmer. You can knock on a farmer's door and ask if you can go and collect samples in his field. Yep, that's absolutely fine. But where does that stand in a legal sense later on if you have nothing documented? And I think museums have got very, very touchy-feely because of the issues of decolonization, which have basically shown up museums to not have correct evidence of where they've got things in the past, be it things from abroad, things from within Britain. Museums are now getting very scared about legal implications of not having everything done by the book. And the knee-jerk reaction has been to tighten up on absolutely everything. And I can foresee that, as a few people have predicted, museums will lose out. So it'll be to the detriment of museums because they will refuse to take things which you and I, everyone on the call, thinks is entirely legitimate, acquired legally. But if you can't prove it, then institutions will just, say we'll stay away from that. We can't be involved with that. Rachel mentioned gold. I'd just like to highlight a good example from Wales. So we recently, so within the last 5 or so years, acquired a very substantial collection of Welsh gold nuggets. They were collected over a lifetime. So the collector was, I presume, in his 70s or so, had collected these with no permission. So he gold panned for his entire lifetime in North Wales in the Dolgellau gold belt. He had provenanced every specimen to the minutest detail. So they were not just mapped out with grid references, but very precisely where in the river system, within the river catchment, he collected them and wanted to sell them. Now, he could have sold them at the market value for gold to be melted down and made into jewelry, but all of that information would have been lost. But because he had panned unofficially and all gold is owned by the Crown, he had to get permission from the Crown to be able to sell them. And the Crown were incredibly pragmatic in that situation. And they basically realized that he could pretend that none of it came from Wales, sell it wherever he wanted, but all of that scientific information would be lost. And so the Crown basically said, the museum can buy the samples for slightly above market value because it was Welsh gold, with all the documentation, and they would not stand any charges against him for profiting from gold panning. And I think that was a really good situation that evolved from that discussion, where the Crown were completely pragmatic and said, yeah, he'd collected them not initially to make profit, but obviously could have done under the radar, made a substantial amount of money out of it. But he didn't want to. He wanted it to go to the institution and be preserved. And the only way that could happen was to get the Crown authorities to say, yep, that's absolutely fine. We're willing to allow him to sell it to you.
Okay, great. That sounds a really good
Can I interpose here, because I'm probably one of the oldest people apart from, well, Shirley Adrian's still about, at nearly 85. Now, I collected in the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, as Martin Stolworthy will know, and I'm an ex-police officer. So I had to be extra careful where I went and what I did. So everywhere I went, I used to get permission. And I had letters always to prove. But of course, in those days, when you'd finished, what did you do? You'd rip the letters up. So I do not have proof that I collected legitimately, but I did. So where does that leave me with my collection?
How you doing?
Somebody answer me that.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things I would like to see come out of this evening is for the GCG and the representatives of each of the national museums to get together and see if they can put something in place to hand back to the museum management to actually say, can we at least get this on the agenda to think about, because you are going to lose out big time. Otherwise.
I think they are, because I won't give my collection to museum, I'll sell it privately.
Yeah.
I think that's, if I can say, interject, I think that's a very important point, and I will take it back to the GCG committee. We may well be ideally placed to do two things. One would be to have a follow-on meeting open to everyone like this, perhaps next year, to see how things have gone and to keep it going. But also with the curators of the major museums and other curators who are interested, put a joint letter together that we can send to museum management, outlining some of these and recommending that they be interpreted as appropriate, at least for rocks and that, and it's different to dealing with, say, paintings. And if we don't, then you're absolutely right. The UK will lose out.
Thanks very much.
We must get away from this idea of retrospective legislation on the current period into the past, because it's always policies always evolve, but it can't be applicable back in time. And
yes, it can.
Yes, it can.
Oh, yes, it can. And
oh, yes, it can.
You see in the papers every day, they go back historical.
Yes, but if you haven't got that information, as you say,
rubbish.
you collected your information at the time you collected it, and you ripped up the
I'm
letters.
a police officer, and I don't think we can go back historically with the laws as they are today, because they're different to what they were 30, 40, 50 years
Precisely.
ago.
Okay, John,
you can't apply what's today.
John, please stop there. Right. Right, I'm going to just pick up some of the points in the chat, if I may. There's quite a lot of things come in, and I'll answer to some extent, and I'll ask the team to comment. So one from Johan, is the legality of ownership just relevant to donations, or does it also apply in sales? I'm sure it would apply to sales, probably more so than donations. James has offered to explain the long process of art gifted to Western Australia. I think we'll leave that for another day, James. Thanks very much. Peter Farker's question, you can all scroll down and see these as I skim through them, about publishing policies. I would think most major museums, if you look on their website, you'll find that information. So yes, I don't think we need to go into that one. Cindy says, put labels of intent on each big part of your collection. So not a bad idea, a bit like the USB stick in the cabinet. And Johan also elaborates on my comment about having a buddy. So this was really to have someone in the mineralogical community, like a friendly collector who's younger than you, or maybe a dealer that you have a relationship with, to advise your heirs on the event of them inheriting your collection. Warren says, this has got me thinking about how do I prove specimens from Greenside mine collected by my relations there were given to be by my grandmother. Well, I guess the bottom line is most miners stole specimens from their employers. They still do. That's how we see the specimens.
Allegedly.
So that's obviously a grey area. Let's get the next two. Thanks, Duncan. Stephen says, as a result of experience, my partner in crime, Robert Lawson, has come up with his law of relativity. Mineral collections don't survive relatives. Well, that maybe is a fair point, and that's really part of what this evening is about. Do make sure that your kids, grandkids, wife, partner knows that there is some stuff here that ought to be looked after. That's really, really important. A question about tax liability. Yes, I don't think there's probably anyone on the call, unless Nick's able to answer this. One of the questions was, if let's say we've got a significant collection, and I guess you're talking about, say, £100,000 if anyone's really going to be interested. What are the issues about tax in the UK? I don't know, does Mike know? If you give or sell something to the museum, do you get any tax benefits in the UK? You certainly do in the States.
Can I come in here, Roy?
Yes, sure. Yep.
Michael, again, Rachel will probably be able to expand on this. I had a conversation with Peter Davison, your colleague, a while back, and he said any donations to the National Museum of Scotland, they could have it valued, and that value would be tax deductible. So I don't know if that is currently the case. And obviously, if you're selling a collection, is that treated as an asset and then has a tax liability? Don't know if
In
Ian
theory,
Bruce
it
is there and
does.
he would know.
You'd have to talk to a Scottish solicitor, I think.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, you can make a capital gain on your collection sale, and yes, it would be taxable.
Right,
and also it forms part of your estate for inheritance tax, the value of your collection.
Yeah, if I can comment, we bought one collection a few years ago, and we actually paid the nominal valuation, which was certainly less than it would have got at auction, and it went through in terms of probate at that nominal valuation. So they didn't actually take it apart, trying to work out what it could have fetched at auction and charge that in terms of inheritance tax. They were quite happy to accept a sort of nominal value.
Right.
I think Linda and David want to say something.
Linda
Right.
or Dave, yeah?
Just a comment on capital gains tax. All right. Last year, the actual gain you can make on selling an asset was 10,000 quid. This year it's £6,000, and next year it's going to be £3,000. So if you are in the habit of buying particularly valuable specimens and then selling them at a later date, just bear in mind the fact that if you make a profit over...
I think we've just lost Portugal. Okay, not to worry, we can come back to that. Anyway, so I think that would again be an interesting area if GCG are able to provide some actual really serious advice.
Lost him.
We're suffering from a breakup of transmission here in the middle of Portugal. But basically, this year you can sell an item and make £6,000 profit, no problem at all. Anything above that will be subject to 20% tax. And next year, 2024-25, you'll only be allowed to make £3,000 profit on an item or items. The Majesty Inspector of Taxes will be interested in you.
Okay, thank you. Gary's made a point. There's a discussion thread loosely about this on Mindat at the moment. This is the question of what happens to collection catalogues once a collection is dispersed, and is there some value in trying to capture that information? I think Mindat are looking to become the home for that, so probably there isn't a need for the Russell Society to start collecting catalogues, but certainly some merit in doing that. Mineral rights, yeah, fine. Okay, Duncan has pointed us out to the cultural gifts scheme, which I'll let you all have a look at later on. The link is in the chat. So, okay. Okay, is there anyone else who's got anything that they would like to contribute or say?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, go on, Linda.
Right, I did raise it in a question to you, and this was about bequeathing collections. It arose because it arose because a member of the Wales and West branch of the Russell Society bequeathed their collection to the Russell Society, and we got involved in having to deal with this some years ago. It wasn't a very good one up, and we eventually put it into the auction at the ASM and got a little bit of money for Russell Society of funds. But if it's a larger collection, or there are some items of particular value, or you want to bequeath your whole collection, say to a museum, what is the museum's attitude? Because I thought if something is bequeathed in a will and then you die, then legally after probate that becomes the property of, say, the museum or the Russell Society.
Yeah, I did.
The recipient doesn't have to receive it. They've got the option not to take the gift.
They can actually turn around and say we don't want it, or
If someone refuses a gift, it then goes back to the other beneficiaries in the estate.
Thank you.
Okay, but I mean the main point, and I think I tried to address this in the presentation, is no museum is going to want all your collection at all, right? So the thing to do is to get the good part or the more interesting part into a state where a museum might be interested in taking it, and do the legwork to do that while you can. I think that's the important point.
Would the Russell Society accept requests made to it, or would this?
Yeah.
If
Yeah,
we
that's
do-
any reason. I did write back and say that. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't do that. Yeah.
Okay.
We've done it quite a few times. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
And I think from the probate forms, having had to do it recently, I think if you're going to claim it against your probate, so you're not paying inheritance tax on it, the recipient actually has to acknowledge that they're accepting it.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Roy?
Yes, Mr. Phil,
Yeah.
yes.
Seems to me that the best solution, because there's an awful lot of talk here about what happens to a collection when somebody dies, is that quite honestly, the best solution is to sort it out during your lifetime, when you can manage the disposal of your own collection in your latter years. And I'm sure they won't mind me saying, and you're almost certainly aware, that Dave and Lizzie Hacker have just done this.
Yeah.
Their remaining collections have just gone, so they've managed it really well. And so these issues of who's going to deal with it later, wills, bequests, all those sort of things disappear. I think that is ultimately the best solution.
Yeah, it requires a lot of honesty on the part of the individual to actually face up to doing it. That's the difficulty.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
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 But yes, I think that a mixed approach is clearly the right solution. And, you know, putting the legwork in now in the next 10, 15 years will help that process. So that's my goal for this evening, is to get you all to go away and have a proper look at your collection and start putting it into some sort of order.
A bit late for some of us.
That's never too late, Dick.
I have a question. I have a question about sensitive data. I'm not a geologist or a paleontologist. I'm a wildlife biologist, and I release sensitive data with specimens that I donate, endangered species, unusual localities, and the museum that I give to here in the States is publishing their information online on online databases, including my field notebook. Every page of my field notebook is online, which is fine for me. I don't have anything compromising in my field notebook, but some people might. Is it acceptable or permissible for me to ask, when I bequeath a collection, that certain sensitive data not be made public?
Okay, that's for the museums team. Mike's going to hit the unmute button, are you? Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess it depends on the institution. Everything's going to have different ways about how they do it, but there
I'll tell you who it is.
there are embargo options, but those embargoes often have to go through a panel, and there has to be very specific reasons given for the embargo, and often they will have a time scale put on them, so it won't be an embargo forever. It might relate to the duration of a specific project or whatever. But certainly my understanding is that that can be possible, but it has to be, can't be done just for the sake of it, and there needs to be good reasoning behind it, and that will get assessed.
But that sort of example Tom gave of all the very, very detailed gold localities, I can't imagine Tom's going to put all that up in the public domain, or every panner in Britain will be legging off to these sites.
Yeah, so that information, Nick, is recorded in a separate database. So if our database gets migrated online at any point, that information will not be released.
Yeah, that would be very sensible.
Okay. I had a flag that Cindy had raised her hand, and also we'll go to John Nuds after Cindy. So Cindy, far away.
It's the two of us, but I was just going to agree with Tom that yes, if there is confidential locality information particularly, then we will ensure that it was not released on a public database at all. That is not a problem. We've done that before.
Great, thank you. And Patrick Roycroft confirms that's possible also in Museum of Ireland. Yeah,
it does too.
Can I say that at BGS we follow pretty much the same? In other words, we wouldn't accept anything that the existence of it couldn't be made public, because if the existence can't be made public, then it can't be used to support science, and that's the whole point of having the collections. But if the sensitive information like localities, particularly fossil localities on private land, then yes, our database flags that up as ask curator for further information. And I have to say, it's actually very, very rare that we do get requests for further information. But if we do, we gauge what the reason is and act appropriately.
Yeah, fine. Okay, right. Tom's reminded me that we had various comments and questions raised in advance, and he's flagging that perhaps we should run through those now. So yeah, Tom's done quite a bit of work on this. So would you like to kick off, Tom? Just pick
Yeah.
up
Okay. So I've got the file open here, so I don't need to share it. I can just read it out.
Yeah.
So the first question was from Phil James, who's online at the moment. And so he said, there seems to be a space issue in many museums preventing quality new material being donated. At the same time, it appears that museums are reluctant to dispose of poor and often scientifically worthless material. And so my response to that was, it's an extremely complicated situation. As the number of specialist mineralogical curators declines, there is a very real risk that curators do not understand the value, i.e. scientific, aesthetic or monetary value of objects within their care. It's very easy for mistakes to be made. Examples being the plethora of culturally significant and historically important specimens, so-called repatriated from British museums through exchanges by mineral dealers during the 1970s and 80s. One of the best, or in this instance, worst examples is the classic and much figured Rowton Gill pyramorphite specimen, once in a collection of Dr. Thomas Brown, who was around from 1774 to 1853, and whose collection was split between, I think it was Edinburgh University and National Museums, or it might be actually Hunterian, thinking about it. But that specimen was, as far as I'm aware, exchanged out from Edinburgh University during the 1980s. It's probably the finest ever specimen collected of pyramorphite from Britain, and now resides, as far as I'm aware, in a private collection in the United States. As time passes, the value and interest in certain mineral specimens changes. And so for deaccession to be justified, it has to be absolutely certain and clear that the specimens might not be useful in the future. I can cite many examples that I've come across of dull-looking specimens from historic 18th and 19th century collections, some of which were deliberately disposed of by museums because at the time, the value of the collection wasn't really realized. And in some instances, those historic collections, the value is not within individual specimens, but the collection as a whole. So if you had the catalogue and all of the individual specimens, it would be a wonderful collection. But as soon as you start to take pieces out because they don't look that interesting, it's very easy to destroy a collection through these innocent mistakes. There was another question. So second one from Phil was, I've recently been informed that museum accreditation prevents any accession specimens from being disposed of. However, section 4.2, managing collections, states that to meet standards, a museum needs to have a policy approved by the governing body for developing collections, including acquisitions and disposals, and adds, information about the legal and ethical framework for acquiring and disposing of items. Therefore, such decisions appear to rest with individual museums. And again, my response to that is this isn't strictly true. Objects can be deaccessioned. For example, if you have pyrite decay taking hold of specimens within collections, these are routinely deaccessioned and disposed of for the simple basis that the specimen no longer exists. So there are ways in which institutions and museums can deaccession objects if it is deemed justifiable.
Sorry, Tom, could I just...
carry on.
The thrust of the question was that someone said to me from a museum that if you're an accredited museum, it's the accreditation rules that prevent the museum from disposing of specimens, but that's not the case, is it?
No, that's not. No. So that's a misinterpretation of what accreditation means.
Yeah.
Can I just say that there is also the proviso that sub-collections, if they're excessively duplicated, can be deaccessioned and then reused within the collections policy, within the education for handling and sending out to schools. That's what we do at our museum in Hazelmere.
Yeah, I would say it's much easier to use things internally than it is to completely deaccession something.
Yeah. And you can offer them to other museums as well before the final deposition. That is also quite common as well.
Yeah, so with deaccessioning, obviously pyrite decay is the exception because the material is completely ruined. But if a museum decided that, that, for example, it had, and this is away from museums, but it had some Egyptian artifacts and they no longer required them, the expectation would be that you offer them to another institution free of charge to start off with. And if no one wants them, then you can look at whether you sell them, but then that goes into a whole different minefield of issues.
Yeah.
I think one of the things is that a lot of museums have a category 1 on the Starkey scale of with no data. There's a lot of stuff, locality unknown and such like, and that stuff can be deaccessioned relatively easily and sort of actually in bulk as well. And there is moves afoot, as it were, in our place. We're sort of encouraged to try and deaccession some stuff. I'm not going overboard about doing it, but there's a lot of stuff that really it's just rubble, nothing more.
So Mike, I think there was another question in there which related to that, and just off the top of my head, I'll try and link this in. So back when Dick Barstow was mineral dealing, he was very astute. So he went, just for example, so Amgueddfa Cymru National Museum of Wales, he got in contact with them and he went through the collection. So he had access to be able to see the specimens. And of course, at the time, the museum wouldn't have exchanged out material which would have been deemed as scientifically important. But being a very astute mineral dealer, he knew that samples of bornonite and tetrahedrite, which were unprovenanced, so had no locality information, and were essentially worthless to the museum, could be exchanged out, and then he could relabel them with the correct provenance of Herodsfoot mine, inflate the value, and then sell them on, or in many cases, keep them in his own collection. So there's a classic example of a National Museum of Wales number label on a specimen in Plymouth Museum, because it resided in Dick Barstow's collection until he died, and then ended up with his collection going to Plymouth Museum. But that was one he legitimately exchanged out of the National Museum of Wales. It's registered in Plymouth Museum as from Herodsfoot mine, but in our catalogues, it was deaccessioned as unprovenanced. And so this is where the experience of museum curators needs to be sort of enhanced, and people with that knowledge need to make the decisions rather than a generalist curator going through a collection and saying, these are all unprovenanced, let's get rid of them. Because somewhere down the line, in 100 years or so in the future, we might have scientific techniques readily available to fingerprint where samples have come from and realize that actually, we could have destroyed collections unwittingly, not knowing that actually we could one day find information about these things.
No, I agree completely, because I think a lot of these specimens, and certainly with fossils, even though it might say unknown, we usually have a pretty good idea where they came from. So one does have to be very careful, with that. But there's a lot of fossils we've got that are really a bit rubbish. If anybody's working on them, they'll go out and collect their own endless Carboniferous brachiopods with no particular provenance.
Can I add to that? Richard Fortey tells a very good story at the Natural History Museum that they had some drawers of rubbish trilobites, and they were essentially earmarked for disposal. They were of no interest, they were unprovenanced, until they had some visitors from Prague who recognized one of them as the type trilobite, or at least the first time the term trilobite had been used. I think it was an English gentleman on his grand tour of Europe had brought one back and described it as a trilobite, and that was the first time that the actual term trilobite had been used. So it's a good example. If it hadn't been from those visitors from Prague visiting, they would never have known the significance of that specimen. And I sometimes feel it's better to dispose of stuff that is provenanced and you can tell is really grotty and of no use, rather than some of the stuff that, well, it might actually be quite important. We don't know what it is at the moment, but somebody might come along and say, yes, that's from Hereford mine or wherever it is.
Yeah, okay. I'll just draw your attention to a couple of comments in the chat. James has asked how, if you have a specimen with a label from a major museum, let's say the American Museum of Natural History, how could you prove that you obtained it legitimately? Well, probably you bought it from someone else who bought it from someone else. So it may be difficult. And Mike has made the point that most museums would have exchange registers, which would actually say, we exchange this with, let's say, Tom Smith in 1964, and we got this in exchange. So it would be possible in many cases to go back and check that out.
Just to comment on that, Roy, I mean, museums keep records of everything. And so all those things are often really well documented. They're not the sort of thing that's going to be top priority for digitization to make them accessible, because they're really an internal document that helps manage the collection, so that you know that something's not there anymore, or that something's left at some period of time. So really, if there's something like that and there's a requirement to show that it's come from a museum, the best thing to do is actually just get in touch with that museum and ask them about it. And it's worth saying that there's policies currently that we document disposals too. So if there's something that's unregistered or that needs to surplus to requirement or doesn't have a number and it goes, all of that process and thought process behind that being disposed of is also documented and archived. So yeah, even though it might not seem that something's there, best thing to do is to reach out and find out.
That also assumes that the museum records are up to date. So the example I mentioned with Dick Barstow, so I came across these specimens as missing from the collection, nothing in the registers, and then I found some old letters written by Dick Barstow to Emlyn Evans, who was a curator back in the 70s, and there was nothing to say that the specimens were exchanged out to the museum, but there were wish lists. So Dick Barstow basically highlighted which specimens he was interested in from the museum collection. And so one can assume that because the specimens now in Plymouth Museum in Dick Barstow's collection, that a successful exchange was carried out, but it was never documented other than Dick Barstow's letter asking for the specimen.
Okay. Any other contributions? Gary?
At least the specimens are still in existence and we know about them. That's the main thing, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. Okay. Okay. I think we're possibly starting to run out of steam. Has anyone got anything else they'd like to say before we wrap up?
So I might say something, Roy.
Yeah, Richard, go on. Yeah.
Yes, well, there's quite often people speak to me about their collections and how to dispose of them. And something that's worth stressing, it's just been mentioned sort of peripherally, is that you can put a list of wishes with your will. So you haven't got to keep on rewriting the will or going to solicitors. You can say in the will, I refer to this list of wishes, and the solicitors will, whoever's dealing with the will have a look at it. And so you can change your mind without having to rewrite the will. That's what I'm saying, and it's perhaps not so well known that you can do this. The other thing is that if you leave money to a charity in a will, it does actually reduce the percentage of tax you have to pay. I forget. It's worth looking at. I can't remember what the exact details are, but it makes a slight difference to the yeah. So that's something.
Yeah. Okay. But I think whatever route you choose, make a plan, get those labels on the specimens and make sure it's organized. And if you can get as far as getting a catalogue, ideally something electronic would be really good. That's going to oil the wheels and make anything you do with it much easier. So,
got something to chip in there, Roy.
Yeah.
Particularly with regards to the catalogue and the way we haven't talked too much about that. But if you do have that conversation with an appropriate institution that shares the same vision for a collection that you might have, and it fulfills the needs of that institution, it's really important to talk to them about the structure of their data and the data that they require, because what you really want to do is try and make that ingestion and recording of that data as painless and difficult as possible to make that collection accessible for the future. So for instance, we acquired quite a large collection a little while ago, large-ish, about 2,000 samples with a brilliant catalogue. Already on Excel, already perfectly organized. Most of the data is already in there. Most of the details are already there. And yet it's still taken about 4 to 5 months to massage that data appropriately to make it correlate with the data that's already within the museum's setup. So to match localities, to match reference numbers, to put all the appropriate extra information in. So even when you have that perfect thing, there's quite a lot of extra work still to do. Just to ingest the data into your, so have that conversation. I think it's really important and often not realised.
What is the best format then, Mike? Is Excel acceptable to most of the museums?
So most museums are going to have a. Can I just answer the question, Mike?
Yep, and then I'll answer it too.
Absolutely. most museums have different cataloging systems, and so that's why it's good to talk to that museum in particular. Excel's a pretty good one to use because most of the different cataloging systems that museums, or collections management systems as we all call them, will be able to ingest and take data from Excel, because it's very cleverly organized. You can comma delineate, you know, all your fields and things. So most databases can get that. So Excel is a pretty good one and a simple one that we're all familiar with.
Yeah, it's also a package which Microsoft are fairly committed to keeping going. Yeah.
Can I add too that if you store it as a CSV, comma-separated variable file, then it's easily accessible to any of the spreadsheet packages or a whole variety of long-term digital preservation solutions. I just want to add that the GCG has actually been doing some work over the last few days, partly prompted by this meeting, to try and draw up ideas for a sort of common recommended spreadsheet format. Clearly, spreadsheets are certainly the best way of doing it. It's a really good way not only of seeing the data, seeing that the fields are filled in, getting a feel from the structure, seeing your columns, but also it's quite easy then to import into Access, Oracle, or other more sophisticated databases. And I have a template which I put around GCG for suggestions, and I haven't actually had much feedback yet. If anybody would like to email me, I'll put my email in the chat shortly. I will very happily send you a copy of the spreadsheet, and we're looking for comments. But I have to say that Mike made a comment about localities and matching localities. We are absolutely committed to really accurate either British National Grid or Latin long, because that's the easiest way of matching localities. And of course, most of the stuff that we produce, we plot on maps in our GIS, geographical information systems like GeoIndex. So we need those grid references if we're going to show the specimens. So if anyone is interested in looking at one potential rec format, please drop me an email. I'll stick it in the chat shortly. And you know, we look for feedback, comments. It would be really good to draw up a spreadsheet that perhaps satisfies Mike, certainly satisfies BGS and as many other of the museums as possible. Because I certainly, in the case of BGS, if we're offered a collection, the biggest hurdle is actually the time taken to curate it. And that's digitizing, if it's labels or whatever it is. Getting that in digital format is really important and would be strongly in favor of taking a collection. Okay,
thanks, Mike. Yeah, a few more things just popped up in the chat. Just touch on quickly. Warren Allison saying, given the lack of museum curators regarding minerals, how do we ensure local museums realise what they have? I have to say I'm pretty pessimistic about the outlook for that. I think most of the institutions that are likely to be worth talking to are here tonight. And, you know, I've included Oxford University Museum of Natural History. Duncan is on the call still, I think. If the institution doesn't have a knowledgeable subject specialist curator, I would walk away. And that's quite a tragedy for Truro as an example, because I think there'll be quite a lot of people in Cornwall would hitherto have thought about bequeathing their beloved collection to the Royal Cornwall Museum. That's very unlikely under current circumstances. So over to the museum sector to make yourselves attractive. No,
we're doing our best.
Yes, indeed. And there was another one at the bottom. Oh, this is back to database formatting. I think the important thing is have it in some sort of format that you can still read 20 years' time. The suggestion here is the engineering geology industry have a standard AGS format. Someone else is suggesting MinDat is sort of taking over the world. Well, maybe Jolyon would like that. But yeah, we need some sort of general thing that you can get the data out of. It probably doesn't matter the specifics too much. Okay.
Isn't it a good idea to periodically print it out as well and have it on paper?
No harm. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Quick comment there, Roy, if I may. This is Tom, Russell Society member. I also volunteer at NHM and involved quite a few other different organisations. One of the things that I've done with my collection, although it's modest, is put a backup of my database on a USB stick. This has also been deposited with a few institutions which are unlikely to actually receive more than the odd part of my collection, but then at least a single Excel spreadsheet, for instance, is not something that is particularly onerous for an organisation to own. So, for instance, the NHM have a copy of it already on my cloud share space, which could always be accessed, and also in a USB stick in a drawer. And so does Plymouth University, and so does Plymouth Museum. It's probably unnecessary, but it's one of those things where it costs virtually nothing. And if any of those institutions were to inherit part of the collection or be contacted by a museum that did, then they would have access to that. Which is quite a simple suggestion if you're part of multiple organisations or have access to them.
Yeah, fine. One other thing that just occurred to me that was submitted in advance, and I did mean to pick up, there was a suggestion that there could be some sort of register of collections, which personally I view as being impractical. It's the wrong way round. It's down to you guys to actually take ownership of the problem and to make sure that the stuff is adequately identified. But one of the questions that arises from that is, if you advertise the fact that you happen to have a £20,000, £100,000 mineral collection, people will view that as a security risk. And so that's one of the reasons people are fairly hesitant about sharing data. So just bear that in mind as well. Okay, I think we're probably about to draw it to a close. So I go back to the panelists. Have you got any last final words? Any of you would like to chip in?
I want to follow up on something you said there about local museums, Roy. I don't know what the solution is. It's very sad that we don't have the mineralogical, geological expertise in some of the more regional museums, small museums. I think that really it's very disappointing to hear you say that you think, oh, don't bother, because actually I think for many collections that the place, the museum that can benefit the most from people's collections are those ones that are local. And it would be great to see if perhaps also through perhaps this discussion to trigger another talk about well, how might we change that?
Yeah,
and get more mineralogical expertise of curators into small local regional museums. You know,
I think they want to know, Mike. I live in Norwich, and our museum is basically an art and crafts museum now. I retired in 2001, and I spent up until the day before COVID struck, cataloguing their geological collections for them. I did all the minerals, all the rocks, and I was plowing my way through 30,000 specimens of fossils. Our curator, who was extremely clever chap, is now working from home, I think 2 or 3 days a week. He's got aged parents over in Wales where he goes across and sees them every 3 or 4 weeks and spends time away from the office. I've not heard from him now for nearly 2 years. I'm no longer in contact with the museum to do anything. And they got no interest at all in what I was doing.
It's that's very sad. It's very disappointing. I guess I've always wondered whether there is a way, perhaps through groups like GCG, in collaboration with other more national groups. I'm only obviously thinking in the UK because that's the situation I know, to almost have some kind of peripatetic curatorial aspect to things. Whether I don't know whether there's a way of circulating the resource that we do have around some of those smaller museums. Something to think about. Obviously not for this discussion, but I just thought I'd raise it, that it was I think it's quite sad to really rule out the regional museums just because there's no expertise right now. I think really we could be looking towards trying to find a solution to that, or helping that problem.
So probably Mike, through volunteers, through the likes of the Russell Society and other geological clubs and societies, working in conjunction with travelling curators who now and again would visit museums to see what had been done and make decisions, you know, to bring it all together really. But there's a lot of volunteers, a lot of expertise in the amateur field, I think.
There's always
degree this has been done before. Peripatetic curators were employed in geology in the 1980s. It was quite a common theme, but it seems to have disappeared through lack of funding, whatever.
Yeah,
certainly remember that.
Mike Taylor was at Bristol, and he was peripatetic, so he was going around all the museums kind of the southwest, and they went up to Scotland. such
Yeah,
like. But
science-
there is
The main
Right,
issue
right.
is money. It's the
Oh, yeah,
financial
yeah.
side is the greatest stumbling block, I think, for,
And then-
for numerous facets of this problem.
There's an issue also, one of the problems with volunteers. Museums are quite hesitant about giving kind of volunteers any sort of free rein. So the curators that there, we have to almost like hold the hands of the volunteers, because there've been one or two bad apples over the years, this people probably know about, and that's kind of changed the whole thing. One final thing actually I'll just say is that even, I mean, it's tragic what's happened to the sort of the provincial, local museums, and I've seen those sort of wither and die in my lifetime, but it's not necessarily that much better than national museums. I'm the only geology curator. I've been the only one for 6 years now at National Museum of NI, and I'm not in the first flush of youth, and there's no imminent prospect of a successor yet. So I always tend to sort of think, if somebody's sort of thinking, oh well, donate stuff to the Ulster Museum, well, think twice, because the stuff will be safe, but it'll just sit there and gather dust.
Yeah.
Roy, could I just say that the reason I asked that question was that there's a local museum next to me, well, near me. It has one of the finest collections in the country, and I really don't think they realise what they've got.
I'm sure you're right. You're thinking of Carlisle, I guess.
Yeah. I certainly am.
Yeah.
They've got no idea.
Yeah, I don't think we can solve that problem tonight, unfortunately, but I guess this is the hardcore to some extent of the collector community that are actually interested in doing something about this. And in my experience in the last 5 to 10 years, increasingly when you contact somewhere, and I'll use Sheffield as an example, on a research project, can I come and have a look at your XYZ items in the collection? The initial reaction is, well, we don't have anyone that knows anything about it. We have a natural sciences curator, he's an archaeologist, and what actually happened, I did get permission to visit, and they basically let me into the store on the basis of reasonable credentials and just left me to it, which is completely unsatisfactory for everybody.
Roy,
that's the only word happened
to me.
Roy, I've got another example. So Jan Freeman's replacement at the Box, Plymouth Museum. So I wanted to go and do some research, but of course they've changed their natural history curator to someone who's not a mineralogical or a geological specialist. And I, of course, wanted to go and look at catalogues and copper arsenates. And of course, as soon as I mentioned copper arsenates, no, not safe. We need to do a risk assessment. And so I was then having to advise them on what minerals are hazardous from an external point of view to be able to get access to go and do research. So anyone else has got no chance. So it's, very unfortunate situation.
Same problems with collections of asbestos. Mention the word.
Yeah.
There are procedures in place for that particular one, but
yeah, they put a bit of tape around it and put it in a cupboard somewhere.
Bag it up, yeah. Okay, well, it's 10 to 10, so I think we've probably given it a pretty good airing. I'd like to say a really big thank you to our 6 panelists for agreeing to come on and take all the flack. I hope it's been a useful two-way process, and most particularly,
very good, very enjoyable.
I hope that the collecting fraternity will go and spend at least some time tomorrow sticking labels on specimens and maybe making a start on that catalogue. So
that's one thing I haven't got to do. That's already done. So
you're a good man. You're a good man. Okay, so please, if you've enjoyed that and found it interesting, tell your friends. We will be, if I've done it right, making the recording available, and I'll publicize that fairly widely. And I'll also try and write up some sort of transcript of the chat and the comments and the discussion so that we capture what's been said. So thank you all very much. And I'm going to...
Roy, before you finish, if you're going to put a transcript, I was looking at some of the links, which are not easy to capture quickly.
Yeah, I get an actual text file of the chat.
Yes, and you've got some in your talk, but where are you going to put it? We can put it as a posting on the Russell Society.
Yeah, we'll sort the detail out later.
Yeah, well, just so people know where to find it.
Yeah. Well, everyone here I've got email addresses for, so you'll get the information. Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to stop recording.
Thank you very much.